Good to see you all. I'm so happy that you are interested in this topic. I'm interested as to how you got interested in this topic as well. Would you mind if I ask you a couple of questions? First of all, who has read the zero-sum article that we sent out a week or so ago? Okay, very good. Now, with your permission, could I ask you to take a very short survey? Now, I'm going to ask you to grade these things 1 through 8. 8 is the most, and number 1 is the least. How attached do you feel to this group? Now, I'm going to list them. Some of you may have the list already with you. Okay, maybe you can jot these down and then write a number. A, race. Again, how attached do you feel to this group, 1 through 8? A, race. B, religion. C, ethnicity. D, political party. E, gender. F, socioeconomic class. G, nation. H, sports team. I, humanity. I'll give you a minute. F is socioeconomic class. That takes a longer time to write that one, I know. Okay, let's move on and start our discussion here. I'm going to give you a chance to, at the end, to give some feedback, and I'm going to ask you some questions as to how we can resolve some of our societal problems today. So pay attention and think about, while I'm talking, how we can implement these things to resolve some of our societal problems. Now, most of us think of ourselves in relation to one of these groups or other groups than the ones I've mentioned. Those are some of the primary ones. Now, this group identification historically has been quite a good thing. Try to think of some ways that groups really help us. Okay, protection. Think tribally. We're out in the jungle. We need protection against the animals, against other tribes. We learn the ways to do things. How do we hunt? We get guidance, mutual support. And we even have fun together. Many advantages of the group. Now, there's another side to it, however, too. Groups can also be quite destructive. In fact, suicidal. As a matter of fact, humankind is one of the only animal groups that is quite so suicidal. We have become pretty good at killing each other and destroying the positive things about groups. So think about wars, think about slavery, caste systems, classism, gangs. Those are the negative sides of groups. Groups even in the 21st century abide largely still by what you might call the law of the jungle: eat or be eaten. I win, you lose. The most powerful, the most ferocious wins, rules. We're still in the foothills of civilization. We're still trying to get out of that jungle. We have codified many of the those win-lose rules, and Roman law basically says whoever's bigger and more powerful gets to make the rules. They become right. Power becomes right, correct. Morality. I believe that we humans can do better than that. Is everybody on board with us on that? Okay, I hope so. We are quite sophisticated. We have an ability to communicate which is far superior to that of any other animal. We can now communicate across the world instantaneously. Our transportation doesn't take months to get around the world. It takes hours. We can record our accomplishments in history books, in science books, with libraries, computers. This is downright extraordinary as a sophisticated animal. There are no animals that have come close to us. However, I believe we are underutilizing our talents and our sophistication. How can we get out of this? I would call it a conundrum. We're in a rut, and we don't really know how to stop fighting one another. Wars have become ingrained culturally. Fighting each other have become ingrained. Basically, we're still one group against another. You can look back at that list of different groups that we mentioned in the beginning of our conversation. Okay, now let's get into the actual topic, zero sum, that our talk is about today. This is one mechanism, one concept I think that we can use to move us ahead. One giant step in getting us out of this mindset that we're in, which is, as I say, self-destructive. If you do not have a concept in mind, you cannot utilize that concept in order to better your life. And this zero sum versus positive sum versus negative sum triumvirate of concepts, most people don't understand very deeply or understand at all. So let me try to explain what those mean. Zero sum, again, is I win, you lose. we have a finite pie, and that finite pie means that if I take this slice, you have the rest. And since I'm a greedy person, I want to take a bigger piece, which means you get a smaller piece. And that is basically our political system, our economic system, our judicial system. It's a win-lose society that we're living in. Now, let me briefly talk about negative sum. Negative sum is even worse than that. Negative sum is a matter of you have a finite pie, and that finite pie is not only divided, but when we fight about it, we destroy the darn pie. That pie gets smaller. And if we think about some real life situations, let's, for instance, think about war. Any war you like. Take the Second World War. The millions of people that were killed, the billions in today's dollars, probably trillions of dollars of destruction of infrastructure, was all based upon people's zero-sum thinking. And by the way, this was not only Germany and Italy and Japan that had that sort of zero-sum thinking. It was the colonial countries of Europe that had the same idea. We're going to colonize these countries, and at the same time extract as much wealth from those countries. We get richer, they get poorer. And it was actually Germany and Italy that thought, and Japan as well, that thought, you know what, we want to get in on this good game too. That was what World War II was all about. And it got into a racist kind of a zero-sum game as well. To make a long story short, Hitler followed a scientific theory that supported racism called eugenics. And Hitler got a hold of one of these American published eugenics textbooks that was studied widely in the US. When he was in jail in Germany, he read this book. He thought this was his Bible. And he created the concept of the Nordic Aryan race, and everybody else would taint the race, the Jews, the Romani, any minorities, the LGBTQ, the Poles, the Russians. He was on a quest to exterminate them all. So in the end, the pie, if we want to consider that the whole world was a pie, that pie became smaller. Okay, now I'm going to get into the most complicated one, which is positive sum. Positive sum, to the uninitiated, is a sort of miracle. You've got this same one pie, And instead of thinking, okay, I'm going to try to get more and the other guy gets less, which is our political system, economic system, judicial system, sports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It permeates our society. Now, we're going to think in a different way. We can make this pie actually bigger. Now, how the heck do we make the pie bigger? I've listed a bunch of societal problems, either current or historic. Let's start off with slavery. Slavery is a perfect example of zero sum. Okay, I'm going to get all these slaves and we're going to become wealthy because now I've got free labor. What is wrong with that thinking? From what I explained about positive sum, zero sum, negative sum, what's wrong with that theory, that economic concept, that philosophical concept? Okay, is first of all, is that zero sum, negative sum, or positive sum? Well, it's probably, I would say it's zero sum, but it turns into negative sum because oftentimes when you start off with zero sum, you destroy the pie, as in war. So what you were doing here when you enslave people, and you remember slaves were not even allowed to become literate. We wanted to keep slaves uneducated. So a person, if you look in a crass way at people, we are, if you want to look at it economically, a commodity, an investment, and people can be fulfilled. If people are invested in, if you want to look at this crassly and in a non-human way, even in that awful slave owner mentality, if they could have thought of people as even as good investors, this is not a good investment because you have a wealth of potential talent that is worth exponentially more than a slave would be as a robot, as basically a robot. So the same thing translates to what society has become today. We don't have slaves in the old-fashioned sense of 150 years ago, but we've got ghettos and we've got depressed areas. We've got Indian reservations. There are nations throughout the world that are impoverished. There are peoples that we economically take advantage of. It's a replication of that slavery. It's got different forms, but it's a replication. It's a new colonialism. Okay, how about gender inequality? Can we apply those same principles to gender inequality? Well, answer is same thing. Women who have been not allowed to educate themselves fully. We have codified all kinds of laws and religions in our legal systems that have kept women down. Big, big, big mistake, of course. I mean, not even just from a human point of view, which is, of course, the most important thing, but even from an economic point of view, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We're destroying the pie. And unfortunately, a lot of people, you know, you can't get through to them morally, you can't get through to them ethically. As one chain smoker told me years ago, he said, you're never going to be able to convince that person not to smoke anymore. The only thing that you might try to, way that you might try to get through to that person is you explain to them, if you put all that money you put into cigarettes into savings, by now you could buy a house with that money, or something to that effect. Racial equality is basically the same issue that we're talking about throughout this discussion. We still have that group mentality. It's my group against your group. And it's not any one group that has always been on the top. We've switched places innumerable times over history. Here's a hot topic: reparations. Now, if you try to explain to the white community, okay, we need to take some money from you guys, the white guys like me, and give it to the black guys like you, or the Asians like you, or the Native Americans like you, who's going to buy that? Are there any white people that are going to raise their hand? Hey, that's a great idea. No, they're going to say that's a terrible idea. Unless we are thinking positive sum. Now, how about if we make the argument, you know what? We've got this huge resource there. African Americans, Native Americans, any other minorities, let's say Mexican Americans, another group that should have reparations. Let's think of this in a positive sum way. We can increase our economy by question mark, question mark, question mark, trillions of dollars if we fully allow people to develop their potentials. We are sitting on a huge pot of gold and ignoring it, not only ignoring it, destroying it, purposely destroying it. How could we have solved better the conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran? We can include Saudi Arabia. We can include any other country we want to talk about that we've been involved in or potentially are involved in militarily. Vietnam, Korea. How do we apply this zero-sum, positive sum? Part of the major problem, again, in every one of those countries, there's been a conflict. People do not understand other groups in their society, in their culture. people of different tribes. If I use the word tribe, you know what I'm talking about immediately. But there was a sort of tribalism in Vietnam. It was an ideological tribalism, you could say. In Afghanistan, there are distinct, what they still call tribes. There are religious, there are tribal, there are ethnic conflicts. And those are really the basis of what is happening in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in the Middle East in general. You take almost any of the wars in Africa, and it's basically the same issues in Eastern Europe, Bosnia, Herzegovina, you name it, and there's some group clash of one way or another. Caste systems, class systems in Rwanda, Burundi. Those are class ethnic conflicts that caused the genocides there. Now, when we write our history books, we write them from a group point of view. We're unwittingly racializing and nationalizing and continentalizing our histories. We are dividing ourselves. We're setting ourselves up for zero-sum thinking. What we need to be talking about in history is a global point of view, a humanitarian, human point of view, not just humanitarian, human-wise, humankind perspective. In that way, we're not focusing on one nation, which becomes the great nation, and oh, they had this great empire, we defeated all these other people in this zero-sum manner. We won, so we're the good guys, we're right because we're the most powerful Roman law. We need to stop whitewashing our own ethnic groups, our own continent, our own race, our own ethnicity, our own religion, and start thinking from a larger perspective historically and globally, human-wise. Let's not keep dividing ourselves up and cutting and dicing and making more and more conflictual groups. So with that, I would like to ask you now on your own to make an attempt to think from your own perspective with your own problems that you see in life, or the problems that you see around you happening, all of the ethnic conflicts, religious conflicts, class conflicts, etc., and see what you can do now with this new understanding. I hope that this is helpful to you. And with that, I'd like you to please look back on that same list of groups that I gave you before, and can you rate them? 1 through 8 again. Okay. Now, I hope that survey should allow me to see how much progress we have made. If we have more 8s, humanity, that means that we're more hopeful than we were at the start of our conversation. Okay, I would like to open it up now to anybody who has more questions. We can discuss what we think might be the solutions from this zero sum, negative sum, positive sum point of view.
We have one question here, which is, can you talk a little bit more about zero sum as it relates to the classroom?
Very good. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I did touch upon it in our presentation of history. We need to stop whitewashing our history books and present history from a global point of view. No more American history, Black history, Asian history, Hispanic history, Latin American history, Native American history, and the attempted glorification of all of those cultures. None of us were perfect. We have to recognize that. If we try to copy the Euro-American centric histories, we have actually followed in the same footsteps that brought us to this state that we're in today of interclass, interethnic conflict. We're actually unwittingly exacerbating it. But I think beyond the history, we need to be thinking, as I've alluded to, of the big picture, not the small picture. And educators make the mistake unwittingly and with best of intentions, but unwittingly. They think kids are dumb and you need to give them little bits of information piecemeal. The problem is that when you do that, you overwhelm kids. Kids cannot put all the little pieces together. They cannot connect the dots. We're trying to bring the level down to the kids, but at the same time, we're expecting of kids something they can't do. I don't know if you've ever been in a preschool and you ask the kids a question in circle time. You ask them a question, and especially the boys, they'll raise their hand. I have the answer. I have the answer. And they come up with some totally preposterous answer that just shows they don't have the big picture. So what we need to be doing, whatever we're teaching, we need to be thinking about the big picture, the system, the cycle, the interactions, the consequences, the ripple effects.
Is there an example of, on a say more microcosm level, how children in their own interpersonal relationships with each other are exhibiting zero-sum thinking, and then how a teacher can use that as a teachable moment?
Well, yes, and worse than that, I think that teachers are teaching exactly for kids to be thinking narrowly about themselves, not in a positive sum manner. There is a time-worn preschool lesson. The name of the topic for the lesson plan is all about me. Now, can you believe that? You know, in looking back on what we're talking about, zero sum, positive sum, negative sum, all about me. That's, selfishness. That is not the way to build harmony in our society. How about all about us? And when I say us, not all about our group, how about all about all of the groups in society, all the religions, all the holidays, not just our holiday, not just our ethnic hero, but peace heroes, for instance, throughout the world. How do we all celebrate spring holidays? And there are many of them from every major ethnic group, every major religion, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, have a major holiday between vernal equinox and winter solstice. Celebrate them all together. Passover, Diwali, Holy, Lunar New Year, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Those are all, believe it or not, those are New Year holidays and those are spring holidays. And you can add to the list. Easter is actually a spring holiday. Another typical lesson studied from age 3 till about age 6. Every spring, we study spring. Every fall, we study fall. The leaves falling, and spring, the flowers. Then winter, we study the snow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But teachers almost never on that age level will study the seasons. Seasons is the system. That's the cycle. That's the big picture. When you're just studying one at a time, it makes it much harder to learn. And we're doing the kids an injustice to divide everything up like this.
When the kids look around their classroom and they see the variety of children, particularly in an urban area and particularly in an area like where Southeast Asia Center is located, and they see physical differences among each other and they know that there are cultural differences, what can teachers do to use those differences to create a better sense of community and to help children better understand their commonality and their differences? What are some sort of actionable steps that teachers and even community leaders can do?
Two things come to mind immediately. At least I should never limit myself to a certain number, but anyway, one of the problems is Maria Montessori, Reggio Emilia, A.S. Neil Summerhill, John Dewey. All of those educators had a great idea in rebelling against the authoritarian nature of the 19th, 20th centuries, the Industrial Revolution, World War I and II. Wonderful. I still think it was a huge leap forward. However, that idea was taken too far and without full understanding back in the 60s and the 70s. All of a sudden, those educational programs became prevalent. And all of a sudden, it was kids that ran the classroom. I amongst them, demanded we have more freedom in the classroom. A.S. Neil was my Bible. A.S. Neil Summerhill. They are what you call student-centric classrooms. Now, the problem is in those student-centric classrooms, you follow the student. So if the student brings their own racism, ethnocentric ideas, narrow-mindedness into the classroom, that is very hard to break out of. Educators recommend, okay, you should have books and materials and do lessons in your classroom about all of the ethnic groups in your classroom. Of course, if you only have one ethnic group or one race or two races, you're cutting out what percentage of the world? If you are in a ghetto, whether it's a Black, Hispanic ghetto or on the reservation, and you have lots of books and lessons about your own ethnic group, this is not the way to break out of the ghetto. This is not the way to create harmony, especially when you whitewash your own ethnic histories. And I know that's hard for some people to swallow, but maybe it's easier to swallow if you realize that this is the same mistake that the whites made and that got us into all these problems, the Euro-American whites. And now the Blacks, Hispanics, every other ethnic group are following the same pattern. It's not, and I shouldn't even blame just the Euro-Americans, because any religion, any national group that became dominant, they did the same thing. And parts of the world continue to do this blatantly. So it looks as though China is trying to Sinoize basically the world. ISIS tried to do the same thing with their version of Islam. And we can continue in the same cycle of interethnic, interracial, intergroup conflict, suicidally killing each other. It doesn't make any sense. Anybody from Mars, if there were such a person, if they came and they looked at humanity, they would say, are you guys crazy? This is insanity to be killing yourselves like this. What are you fighting about? Why are you not cooperating? There are enough problems in the world without destroying each other.
As we wind this up, we've got a couple more minutes left. Some of the things that you mentioned, dominance, for instance, seems to come out of the concept of self-preservation. So, we start with this idea, which you touched on earlier, of the strongest, the fittest survive. We seem to have, as humans, this self-preservation instinct, which leads to dominance, which leads to zero-sum thinking, which is try to get it all for myself and get rid of the conflict. So is zero-sum thinking anti-human thinking? In other words, is this natural to us and we're trying to overcome a fallibility that we have as humans? Or is there an indication that zero-sum thinking is really a natural way of being? I would be interested to hear how you reconcile that.
I don't think that zero-sum thinking is ingrained in our genes. There are some theories, however, that I don't know if I go along with them or not, but there's some scientific evidence that if you are violent or you experience a violent environment, it gets what's the word? It gets ingrained in your brain. Your brain becomes hardwired to be violent. I think that if we look at history over the long view, which I think we need to do much better than we're doing, we have made a remarkable amount of progress, which shows me that we're not hardwired completely into this insane suicidal behavior. So if we think back 10,000 or so years ago, or even less than that, thousands of years ago, human sacrifice was common. Slavery was common. Even genocide was common. Wars were much more common. And when I say war, it could be tribal wars, not necessarily on the global scale. But we have made a whole lot of progress. Someday, as one author has said, we will look at the word war, the same as we look at the word slavery. It will be just that was something they did way back then, but that's just unthinkable to do now. There are other solutions. There are positive sum solutions that are way better than war. And we've got a book coming up, The End of War, which talks in a lot more depth about this.
I think you hit on a important point just a minute or two ago about if someone came from Mars or someplace else and looked at what we were doing, they would think we were insane. And I think the reason for that in your implication there is because they would see us all as the same. They would see us all as part of the same group.
Good point. Very good point.
And we tend to not see ourselves as part of the same group, and that is where the conflict begins. So, and from what I know about what philosophies you espouse, teaching philosophies, etc., that's where we begin, is we begin to see our common humanity and try to see ourselves as being part of the same human group and not a bunch of subgroups. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think that my darn generation really messed us up. 60s and 70s. We had the best of intentions, and we empowered women, we empowered Blacks, we empowered all ethnic minorities. The problem is that movement went astray. And instead of having a more harmonious society, which we had in mind at the time, we did not anticipate that we would inadvertently, unwittingly be triggering more conflict, more division. But I think that this is exactly what has happened. So we need to be rethinking what we're doing, and how can we think in a positive sum manner? How can we see the big picture? How can we see the historical picture without whitewashing, being more honest with ourselves about the good and the bad of history, learning the lessons from history that have repeated themselves and which we fail to learn. Again and again, we fail to learn. Although we have all the means available, we've got all the history books, all the libraries, the internet, etc., but we don't learn those lessons. We're teaching wrong, and we're thinking about the world still from a group-centric point of view. We've got to widen that view.
Well, I think this has been an interesting hour. We've just about filled the entire hour at this point, and I think, with your permission, I'll just conclude by saying this has been Peter Porr presenting how zero-sum thinking leads to conflict in society and the classroom. It's part of 2 webinars that have been presented as part of the statewide Healing Illinois project. The second part will continue as systemic racial injustice and what we can learn. Peter, thank you. Finish.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. And please try to keep these things in mind and implement them. What I have shared with you is tremendously, tremendously powerful if you utilize it. Good luck to everybody and good luck to humanity.